The next morning, I woke up with a plan in my head. Thandi and I had to speak to Baba Dlamini again. He was the only one who seemed to know anything about the spirit. I found Thandi waiting near the edge of the village, away from the main road where no one could see us together. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept all night. "Ready?" I asked. She nodded, though her face was pale. "Do you think he'll help us?" "He has to," I said. "If anyone knows how to stop the spirit, it's him." We walked quickly to Baba Dlamini's hut, careful not to draw attention. The village was still tense, and people were talking in hushed voices about the sickness spreading. I could feel their fear, and it only made me more determined to do something. When we reached his hut, Baba Dlamini was sitting outside, carving another piece of wood. He looked up as we approached, his sharp eyes narrowing. "You again," he said. "And you've brought someone with you." "This is Thandi," I said. "She's the daughter of Mondlovu." At the mention of Mondlovu, Baba Dlamini's expression grew serious. He set down his carving and motioned for us to sit. "What brings you here?" he asked. Thandi hesitated, so I spoke for her. "We went into the forest yesterday," I said. Baba Dlamini's eyes widened. "You did what?" "We found the spirit," I continued. "It appeared to us near a stone with strange symbols. It knows who Thandi is. It said her mother's debt isn't paid." The old man sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Fools," he muttered. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that was?" "We had to do something," I said. "The spirit is hurting the village. People are getting sick. If we don't stop it, more people could die." Baba Dlamini shook his head. "Stopping it is not so simple," he said. "The spirit is bound by the deal it made, but so is Mondlovu. As long as the debt remains unpaid, the spirit will continue to take its price, piece by piece, life by life." Thandi spoke up, her voice trembling. "Is there a way to end the deal without giving it what it wants?" The elder looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he said, "There is a way, but it is not an easy one. The spirit's power is tied to the stone you saw in the forest. It is both its anchor and its prison. Destroying the stone would break the deal, but it would also release the spirit fully into this world." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What happens if it's released?" I asked. Baba Dlamini's eyes grew darker. "It would no longer be bound by rules. It would have no reason to stop. It could destroy the entire village if it wished." Thandi's face fell. "So there's no way to stop it without risking everyone's lives?" "There is one other way," Baba Dlamini said slowly. "The person who made the deal, your mother, could face the spirit and offer herself as payment. If she does so willingly, the spirit may be satisfied and leave the village in peace." Thandi's hands tightened into fists. "She'll never do that," she said bitterly. "She's too afraid." "Then your choices are limited," the elder said. "Either you destroy the stone and face the spirit's wrath, or you convince your mother to end what she started." The weight of his words settled over us like a heavy cloud. Neither option sounded good, but we couldn't just do nothing. "What happens if we do nothing?" I asked. Baba Dlamini's face grew grim. "The spirit will continue to spread sickness and misfortune until the debt is paid in full. And it will not stop with your village. Its hunger will grow." Thandi's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "We have to do something," she said firmly. I nodded. "We'll think of a plan." "Thank you, Baba." The old man didn't smile or offer words of encouragement. He just watched us leave, his expression as heavy as the burden we carried. As we walked back toward the village, I couldn't stop thinking about what Baba Dlamini had said. Destroying the stone, convincing Mondlovu, or doing nothing, none of those felt like real options. But one way or another, we had to decide. And soon. Thandi and I spent the rest of the day sitting under a tree near the outskirts of the village, going over what Baba Dlamini had told us. The choices were grim, and the weight of the decision was crushing. "She won't listen," Thandi said, breaking the silence. Her voice was heavy with frustration and sadness. She has to, I said. If we tell her what the spirit said and how it's hurting the village, maybe she'll understand. Thandi shook her head. You don't know my mother. She doesn't care about anyone but herself. I didn't want to believe that. Manlova had to care about her daughter, about the people around her. I didn't want to think someone could be so selfish. We have to try, I said. It's the only way. Thandi sighed and nodded reluctantly. Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. That evening, we went to Manlova's house. It was small and dark, sitting at the edge of the village like it didn't belong. Thandi knocked on the door, and it creaked open. Manlova was sitting inside, stirring a pot over a low fire. The smell of herbs and something bitter filled the air. She looked up as we entered, her eyes sharp and suspicious. What are you doing here? She asked, her tone cold. Thandi hesitated, then said, We need to talk. Manlova raised an eyebrow. About what? Thandi glanced at me, and I nodded, stepping forward. About the spirit in the forest, I said. The room grew tense. Manlova's stirring stopped, and her eyes narrowed. You went into the forest? She asked, her voice dangerously low. Yes, I said, standing my ground. We saw the spirit. It's angry, and it's hurting the village. People are getting sick, and it's only going to get worse unless something is done. Manlova's lips pressed into a thin line. You're fools, she said. You shouldn't have gone there. We didn't have a choice, Thandi said. Her voice was shaking, but she kept going. The spirit knows about me, Mama. It said you owe it something, and now it's coming after me instead. Manlova stood up, her face hard. You don't know what you're talking about. Yes, I do, Thandi shouted. Tears filled her eyes as she stepped closer to her mother. You made a deal with it, didn't you? You promised it something, and now it's taking its anger out on everyone else. Manlova's face twisted, and for a moment, I thought she might yell back. But then she turned away, staring at the fire. It was a long time ago, she said quietly. I did what I had to do to survive. Thandi's voice cracked. You didn't just survive, Mama. You made me part of your deal. You gave it my life to save yourself. Manlova's hands tightened into fists. And what was I supposed to do, huh? Let it take me? Leave you alone in this world? You didn't save me, Thandi said bitterly. You doomed me. And now it's not just me, it's everyone in the village. Baba Dlamini says you're the only one who can end this. You have to face the spirit and pay what you owe. Manlova spun around, her face full of anger and fear. You don't understand. That thing doesn't just take, it destroys. If I go back, it will kill me. And even then, it might not stop. Then what are we supposed to do? I asked, stepping forward. Destroy the stone and risk the whole village? Let it keep hurting people? There has to be another way. There is no other way, Manlova snapped. You children shouldn't have gone into the forest. You've made things worse. Thandi's hands trembled, and her voice broke. So that's it? You're just going to let it take me? Let it keep killing people because you're too afraid to fix what you did? Manlova didn't answer. She just stared at the fire, her face unreadable. Thandi shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. I knew you wouldn't help, she said, her voice thick with pain. I knew it. Without another word, she turned and stormed out of the house. I hesitated, looking back at Manlova. For a moment, I thought I saw regret in her eyes, but she said nothing. I followed Thandi outside, finding her sitting on the ground with her head in her hands. I'm sorry, I said softly, sitting beside her. She wiped her eyes, her face set with determination. We'll do it without her, she said. We'll figure something out. I'm not going to let that thing win. I nodded, though fear gnawed at my insides. We were running out of options. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the spirit's glowing red eyes staring back at me, its whispers circling my mind. The memory of Thandi's tears and Monlova's refusal haunted me just as much. When dawn came, I got up and went to meet Thandi. She was already waiting at the edge of the village, her arms crossed and her face set with determination. "We have to go back to the forest," she said the moment she saw me. "Back?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "Yes," she said firmly. "If my mother won't face the spirit, then we'll have to deal with it ourselves. Baba Dlamini said the stone is its anchor. If we destroy it, maybe we can weaken it enough to stop it. But Baba Dlamini also said destroying the stone could make it worse," I reminded her. "What if the spirit gets free and attacks the village?" Thandi looked down, her fists clenched. "We don't have a choice," she said. "If we do nothing, it'll keep hurting people. And if my mother won't take responsibility, then I will." Her words made my chest tighten. She was so brave, even though I could see the fear in her eyes. "Okay," I said. "We'll go back. But we need a plan. We can't just smash the stone and hope for the best." Thandi nodded. "Baba Dlamini knows more about this than anyone. Let's talk to him again. Maybe he can help us figure out what to do." We headed to Baba Dlamini's hut, careful to avoid being seen. The village was waking up, and people were starting their morning routines. I could feel the tension in the air. Everyone knew something was wrong, even if they didn't know the details. When we reached the elder's hut, he was already outside, tending to a small fire. He looked up as we approached, his expression wary. "Back so soon?" he asked. "We need your help," Thandi said. He sighed and gestured for us to sit. "What is it now?" "We want to destroy the stone," she said. Baba Dlamini's eyes widened. "You cannot be serious." "We don't have another choice," Thandi said. "My mother won't do anything to stop the spirit, and people are suffering. If we destroy the stone, maybe we can weaken it." The elder shook his head. "Destroying the stone is dangerous," he said. "The spirit's power is tied to it, but so is its restraint. Without the stone, the spirit will no longer be bound by the forest. It could spread its wrath across the village, and beyond. But if we do nothing, people will keep getting sick," I said. "We can't just wait for it to stop." "It won't." Baba Dlamini rubbed his chin, deep in thought. "If you truly intend to destroy the stone, you must be prepared for what comes after," he said. "The spirit will not let you do it without a fight. And if it is freed, you will need a way to protect yourselves and the village." "Is there a way?" Thandi asked. "There is an old ritual," he said slowly. "It is risky, but it could work. The ritual would banish the spirit back to where it came from, but it requires great strength and courage. And if it fails—" He didn't finish the sentence, but we understood. If it failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. "What do we need for the ritual?" I asked. Baba Dlamini looked at us carefully. "You will need herbs from the forest, specific ones that grow near the stone. You will also need something that belongs to the spirit, something it has touched. Finally, you will need someone willing to confront the spirit directly and perform the ritual under its gaze." "I'll do it," Thandi said without hesitation. I felt my stomach drop. "Thandi, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," she said firmly. "This started because of my mother. It's my responsibility to fix it." Baba Dlamini nodded solemnly. "Very well. But remember, this is not a guarantee. If you are not strong enough, the spirit will consume you." "We understand," Thandi said. The elder gave us a list of the herbs we needed and described their appearance. "Be quick," he said. "The longer you wait, the stronger the spirit becomes." As we left his hut, I felt a mixture of fear and determination. We had a plan now, but it was a dangerous one. "Are you sure about this?" I asked Thandi as we walked toward the forest. She nodded, her face set with determination. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. "I just want to make things right." I wished I could share her confidence, but all I could think about was what might happen if we failed. Thandi and I stood at the edge of the forest, the morning sun casting long shadows through the trees. The forest seemed darker than before, as if the spirit's presence was growing stronger. I took a deep breath and glanced at Thandi. Do you remember what Baba Dlamini said about the herbs? She nodded. He said they grow near the stone, close to the spirit's anchor. One is small with red flowers, and the other is a leafy plant with white streaks. We stepped into the forest, moving carefully and quietly. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Do you think the spirit knows we're here? I whispered. It probably does, Thandi said, her voice low. But we don't have time to be scared. Let's keep going. The deeper we went, the colder it became. The sunlight barely reached the ground, and the air felt heavy. It was like the forest was alive, holding its breath. We reached the area near the stone, and I froze. The strange symbols we'd seen before seemed to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Over there, Thandi whispered, pointing to a patch of red flowers growing near the base of a tree. We moved quickly, pulling the flowers carefully and placing them in the cloth bag Baba Dlamini had given us. The red petals looked almost like drops of blood. What about the other one? I asked, glancing around nervously. Thandi scanned the area, her eyes narrowing. There, she said, pointing to a cluster of plants with white streaked leaves growing near the stone. We approached slowly, the air growing colder with every step. The stone loomed above us, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. As Thandi reached for the plant, a chilling voice echoed through the forest. You return, it said, low and menacing. I froze, my heart pounding. The spirit's shadowy figure appeared near the stone, its glowing red eyes fixed on us. You dare to touch what is mine, it hissed. Thandi didn't stop. Her hands trembled as she plucked the plants and stuffed them into the bag. We're not afraid of you, she said, her voice shaking but firm. The spirit laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. Brave words, little one. But bravery will not save you. It moved closer, its shadow stretching toward us. Your mother's debt remains unpaid, and now you seek to defy me? Foolish children! I grabbed a stick from the ground and held it in front of me, though I knew it was useless. Leave us alone! I shouted. The spirit's laughter grew louder. You cannot command me, child. Your fear feeds me. Your defiance amuses me. Thandi stood up, clutching the bag tightly. We're not afraid, she repeated, though I could see the fear in her eyes. We're going to stop you. The spirit tilted its head, as if studying her. You think you can stop me? It said. You are nothing but a pawn in this game, a sacrifice waiting to be claimed. I grabbed Thandi's arm. We have what we need. Let's go! We turned and ran, the spirit's laughter echoing behind us. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting and shifting as if trying to trap us. Don't look back! I shouted, my chest burning as we sprinted through the tangled undergrowth. Somehow, we made it out of the forest, collapsing onto the ground at the edge of the village. My hands were shaking, and my heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. Thandi opened the bag, checking the herbs. We got them, she said, her voice breathless but relieved. I nodded, trying to catch my breath. What now? We go back to Baba Dlamini, she said. We have the herbs. Now we need to prepare for the ritual. As we stood up and started walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit's words were still following us. You are nothing but a pawn, it had said. But I didn't care. We were going to prove it wrong. When we got back to Baba Dlamini's hut, he was waiting outside, as if he already knew we'd succeeded. His sharp eyes fell on the bag Thandi was carrying, and he gave a small nod. You have the herbs, he said. Yes, Thandi replied, handing him the bag. But the spirit saw us. It knows what we're doing. Baba Dlamini frowned. That was to be expected. The spirit is bound to the stone, but its reach is growing. It will not let you do this easily. What do we do now? I asked. The elder opened the bag, examining the herbs carefully. He set them aside, then turned to us. There is still one thing you need, he said. The thing the spirit touched, Thandi said. Baba Dlamini nodded. Something connected to it, tied to its power. It will act as a bridge between this world and the spirit's domain. Without it, the ritual will fail. Thandi looked confused. How do we find something like that? The spirit has marked many things in its anger, Baba Dlamini said. Look for signs, objects that feel cold to the touch, places where life has withered. The closer you get to the spirit's power, the stronger the signs will be. I shivered, remembering the chill in the forest. So we have to go back? Yes, Baba Dlamini said. The stone itself would be the ideal object, but it is too dangerous to touch. You must find something nearby, something it has claimed. Thandi's jaw tightened. We'll find it, she said. The elder nodded. Be careful. The spirit will sense what you're doing and try to stop you. You must not lose focus. He handed us a small pouch filled with gray powder. Scatter this if the spirit comes too close. It will not stop it, but it will slow it down. Thandi took the pouch and tucked it into her pocket. Thank you, she said. Baba Dlamini placed a hand on her shoulder. You are brave, child. But bravery alone will not save you. Remember what I taught you. She nodded, and we turned to leave. As we walked back toward the forest, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what we were about to do. Every step felt heavier, like the spirit's presence was pressing down on us. Do you think we'll find it? I asked, trying to break the silence. We have to, Thandi said. There's no other way. When we reached the forest edge, we paused. The trees seemed darker, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. The air was colder than before, and the silence was deafening. Thandi took a deep breath. Let's go. We stepped into the forest, moving slowly and carefully. Every shadow felt alive, every sound made me jump. As we got closer to the stone, the air grew colder. I could feel it seeping into my bones, making my teeth chatter. Look around, Thandi whispered. There has to be something here. We searched the area, our eyes scanning for anything unusual. Then I saw it, a small wooden carving lying on the ground near the stone. It was shaped like a bird, but the edges were blackened, as if it had been burned. Thandi, look, I said, pointing to the carving. She picked it up, her face pale. It's freezing, she said, her breath visible in the cold air. That has to be it, I said. But before we could move, the ground beneath us began to shake. The stone's glowing symbols pulsed brighter, and the spirit's voice echoed through the forest. You dare to take what is mine! It roared. Thandi grabbed my arm. Run! We sprinted through the forest, the carving clutched tightly in her hand. The spirit's shadow stretched behind us, growing larger and larger. Scatter the powder! Thandi shouted. I fumbled with the pouch, pulling it open and throwing the powder behind us. The spirit let out a furious scream as the powder formed a barrier of gray mist. It's working! I shouted. But the spirit's rage only grew. The ground trembled, and the trees groaned as if they were alive. Just keep running! Thandi yelled. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the forest, collapsing onto the ground. The carving was still in Thandi's hand, its surface cold and rough. We did it, she said, her voice shaking. I nodded, though my heart was still racing. Now we have everything we need. But as we got up and started walking back to Baba Dlamini's hut, I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit's anger wasn't just about the carving. It felt like it was planning something worse than anything we'd seen before. When we got back to Baba Dlamini's hut, the elder was waiting outside again. He seemed relieved when he saw us, but his expression turned serious when Thandi held up the wooden carving. This, she said, her voice trembling slightly. This is what we found. It was near the stone. The spirit chased us when we took it. Baba Dlamini took the carving, his hand steady despite the chill radiating from the object. He studied it for a long moment, then nodded. This will do, he said. The spirit's energy clings to it. It is tied to the stone, and through that, to the spirit itself. Thandi exhaled, her shoulders relaxing just a little. So we're ready now? Almost, the elder said. Now we must prepare the ritual. This will not be easy, and the spirit will sense what we are doing. It will try to stop us. I shifted uneasily. What exactly happens during the ritual? Baba Dlamini's gaze turned somber. The ritual is a binding and a banishment. It will sever the spirit's hold on this world and force it back to where it came from. But doing so will require a strong will and an unshaken heart. If the spirit senses doubt or fear, it will exploit it. Thandi nodded. I'll do it. Just tell me what to do. The elder's face softened, though there was still a trace of worry in his eyes. You are brave, child, but bravery alone will not protect you. You must be prepared for the spirit's tricks. It will use your fears, your memories, and even your loved ones against you. Thandi's expression hardened. I don't care what it does. I'm not giving up. Baba Dlamini looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. Let us begin the preparations. We followed him inside his hut. The air was thick with the smell of herbs and smoke, and strange symbols were painted on the walls. Baba Dlamini set the carving on a small table and began grinding the herbs we had gathered into a fine powder. This powder will be scattered during the ritual, he explained. It will form a barrier to protect you from the spirit's full power. But the barrier will not hold if you lose focus. He handed Thandi a small clay bowl filled with the powder. When the spirit comes, you must stand your ground and speak the words I will teach you. They will call upon the ancestors to aid you in banishing the spirit. What about the carving? I asked. The carving is the key, Baba Dlamini said. It will act as a bridge, drawing the spirit's power into the circle. Once the power is contained, you must destroy the carving to break the spirit's hold on this world. I felt a chill run down my spine. What if we fail? The elder's eyes darkened. If you fail, the spirit will not stop until it consumes everything it touches. It will spread beyond the village, leaving nothing but pain and death in its wake. The weight of his words hung heavily in the room. Thandi didn't flinch. We won't fail, she said. Baba Dlamini nodded, his expression grim but respectful. We will perform the ritual tonight, when the spirit's power is at its peak. Rest now. You will need your strength. As Thandi and I stepped outside, the sun was beginning to set. The forest loomed in the distance, its dark shadows stretching across the village. Are you scared? I asked her quietly. Of course, she said. But I can't let that stop me. This is my fight, and I'm going to finish it. I admired her courage, but I couldn't shake the fear growing in my chest. The spirit had warned us before, and I knew it wouldn't go down without a fight. That night, as we gathered with Baba Dlamini at the edge of the forest, the air felt heavy with tension. The elder drew a large circle in the dirt, sprinkling the powdered herbs along the edge. He placed the wooden carving in the center of the circle and motioned for Thandi to step inside. This is it, he said. Once we begin, there is no turning back. Thandi took a deep breath and stepped into the circle. I stood outside, clutching another pouch of powder, ready to scatter it if the spirit tried to attack. Baba Dlamini began chanting in a low, steady voice, his words ancient and powerful. The air around us grew colder, and the ground seemed to hum with energy. Then, from the darkness of the forest, the spirit appeared. Its glowing red eyes burned with fury, and its voice echoed like thunder. You dare to defy me? It roared. Thandi stood her ground, her hands trembling but steady. This ends tonight, she said, her voice strong. The spirit laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. Foolish child. You cannot stop me. But as Baba Dlamini's chanting grew louder, the spirit hesitated, its shadowy form flickering. Thandi began to speak the words the elder had taught her, her voice rising above the spirit's angry growls. The ground inside the circle began to glow, the symbols drawn in the dirt shining brightly. The spirit screamed, its form twisting and writhing as if in pain. Keep going! Baba Dlamini shouted. Thandi's voice wavered for a moment, but she didn't stop. The spirit's fury grew, and it lunged toward her, its shadowy arms reaching out. I threw a handful of powder into the air, creating a barrier of mist that stopped the spirit in its tracks. It howled in rage, but it couldn't get through. Thandi reached the final words of the chant, and the carving in the center of the circle began to crack. The spirit let out a deafening roar as its power was pulled into the carving, its form growing smaller and weaker. "Now!" Baba Dlamini shouted. Thandi raised her foot and brought it down on the carving, shattering it into pieces. A blinding light filled the circle, and the spirit let out one final, agonized scream before vanishing. The forest fell silent. "It's over," Thandi whispered, her voice shaking. Baba Dlamini stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You have done well, child. The spirit is gone." But as I looked at the shattered pieces of the carving, I couldn't help but wonder, was it truly over? The night was eerily quiet after the spirit vanished. The air no longer felt thick with fear, but it also felt empty. As though something important had been taken away, leaving behind a hollow space. We all stood in the circle for a moment, letting the silence settle around us. Baba Dlamini was the first to break the stillness. "It's done," he said, his voice calm but filled with relief. "The spirit has been banished. You did well, Thandi." Thandi nodded, but she didn't smile. Her face was pale, and I could see that the weight of what had happened was sinking in. The reality of the danger we had just faced, the power we had almost failed to contain, it was all starting to hit her. I wanted to say something comforting, but I didn't have the words. I just stood there, watching her, knowing that we were both changed by what had happened. "Let's go home," Baba Dlamini said. "You both need rest. The village will be safe now, but there is still much to do." We walked back to the village, the first light of dawn starting to break over the horizon. The trees seemed less menacing now, their branches no longer reaching out like claws. The path felt clearer, the air lighter. As we entered the village, people began to come out of their homes. They looked at us curiously, but when they saw the expressions on our faces, they fell silent. It wasn't just the defeat of the spirit that weighed on us. It was the realization that everything was different now. "Is it over?" one of the elders asked, his voice full of uncertainty. "Yes," Baba Dlamini answered. "It is over. The spirit is gone, and the curse has been lifted. The village is safe again." A wave of relief swept over the crowd, but there was something else in their eyes too. It was as if they were finally seeing the truth of what had happened, and the cost of it all. Thandi stood silently beside me, her eyes distant. I knew that even though the spirit was gone, its influence would still linger in her heart. She had faced something dark, something dangerous, and she had come out the other side, but not without scars. Baba Dlamini turned to us. "You must rest now. We'll talk more when you're ready." But I didn't feel like resting. I didn't feel like going home and pretending everything was normal. Not after everything we had just experienced. "Thandi," I said quietly. "Are you okay?" She looked at me, her eyes sad but resolute. "I'm fine," she said, but I could tell she wasn't. "But I don't think I'll ever be the same again." I nodded. I didn't think I would ever be the same either. That night, we all gathered in Baba Dlamini's hut to discuss what had happened. The elder had set up a fire in the center of the room, its flickering light casting shadows on the walls. "Now that the spirit is gone, there are still things we must address," Baba Dlamini said. "The stone, the carving, they are not just objects. They are part of a deeper power. We must ensure the spirit cannot return." Thandi looked at him, her brow furrowed. "How do we do that?" "The stone is cursed," Baba Dlamini said. "It has been for generations. The carving was just a vessel. But now, the spirit is gone, and its power has been broken. We must seal the stone, destroy the remaining traces of the curse." "Will it be dangerous?" I asked. "Yes," Baba Dlamini said. "But it must be done. There is no other way to be sure the spirit cannot return." I looked at Thandi. She was quiet, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. "What do we need to do?" she asked. Baba Dlamini took a deep breath. We need to go back to the forest. We need to cleanse the stone, remove the last traces of the curse, and seal it with a protective ritual. Thandi stood up. When? Soon, Baba Dlamini replied. Before the spirit can find a way to return. I swallowed hard. But what if it's not really gone? What if it's waiting for us to make a mistake? Baba Dlamini's eyes darkened. That is why we must act quickly. The spirit will always try to find a way back if there's any chance left. That is why we cannot hesitate. The room was heavy with the weight of what had to be done. I'll go, Thandi said, her voice steady. We'll finish it. For good. I looked at her, then at Baba Dlamini. I knew what needed to be done, but I wasn't sure I had the strength to face it again. Baba Dlamini gave us a nod of approval. Tomorrow we go. Rest now. You will need your strength. But sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the spirit's red eyes burning through the darkness, and I heard its voice, its threats echoing in my mind. Would it really be gone, or had we just made it angrier? The next morning, the sky was a dull gray, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The village was quiet, everyone too cautious to speak too loudly. I couldn't help but feel the weight of the past few days hanging over us, a quiet tension in the air. Baba Dlamini had already prepared the necessary tools for the final ritual. He handed us each a small pouch filled with herbs and powder, just like the one we had used before. These will help protect you, he said. But do not let your guard down. The spirit may not show itself, but it will try to stop us in other ways. We gathered what little we needed for the journey and started toward the forest. It was early, and the trees stood silent, their dark shadows stretching across the ground. The air felt thick again, like the spirit was still close, watching us from the depths of the woods. Do you really think the spirit is gone? I asked quietly as we walked. Thandi didn't look at me. I have to believe it is. We reached the edge of the forest, where Baba Dlamini stopped and looked around carefully. We'll go straight to the stone, he said. The longer we stay here, the more vulnerable we are. Thandi nodded, her jaw set. Let's do this. We moved into the forest, walking quickly but cautiously. The trees seemed more oppressive now, the branches twisting and bending as if reaching for us. The forest was no longer the peaceful place it had once been, it felt alive with something dark, something watching. When we reached the clearing where the stone had once stood, I felt the familiar chill in the air. The stone was still there, just as it had been before, standing tall and silent. But now, there was an unnatural stillness to the area, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. This is it, Baba Dlamini said, stopping just outside the clearing. We need to cleanse the stone and seal it. The ritual must be performed exactly as I say. He handed Thandi a small bowl filled with the same gray powder we had used before. This is the last step. When the ritual begins, you will need to sprinkle this around the stone. It will help weaken its power and seal the spirit's influence. Thandi took the bowl carefully, her hands shaking slightly. I could tell she was nervous, but there was determination in her eyes. She wasn't going to let anything stop her now. Baba Dlamini began chanting the same words he had used during the first ritual, his voice steady and strong. Thandi stood beside him, her back straight, her hands trembling slightly as she held the bowl. I looked around the clearing, my heart racing. There was no sign of the spirit, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. Thandi, I whispered. Are you sure this is going to work? She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. It has to. Baba Dlamini's chanting grew louder, and the ground beneath us began to tremble. The stone started to glow faintly, just like it had the first time, and a strange hum filled the air. This is it, Baba Dlamini said. Sprinkle the powder now, Thandi. Thandi hesitated for only a second before she stepped forward, scattering the powder around the stone. The air grew colder, the hum from the stone growing louder. For a moment, everything went silent, and then, with a sudden crack, the ground shook violently. The stone pulsed with light, and I could see the spirit's shadowy form beginning to rise from the ground. Its glowing red eyes burned with fury. You dare to challenge me again? The spirit howled. I will destroy you all! Thandi's face paled, but she didn't falter. She stood tall and continued to sprinkle the powder around the stone, her voice chanting the words Baba Dlamini had taught her. The spirit's form grew stronger, and I could feel its anger building. It lunged at Thandi, its shadowy hands reaching for her, but before it could touch her, Baba Dlamini shouted, Keep going, Thandi! You're almost there! Thandi's voice grew louder, more confident, as the power of the spirit fought against the ritual. The air grew colder, and the trees around us creaked as if they were groaning in pain. The ground trembled again, and I could feel the spirit trying to push through, its power fighting against the ritual's strength. But Thandi didn't stop. She finished the chant, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. With a final burst of energy, the stone erupted with light, and the spirit let out a deafening scream. The light around the stone grew blinding, and I had to shield my eyes. When the light finally faded, the spirit was gone. The stone stood there, still and silent once more. Thandi dropped to her knees, exhausted. Did we do it? She whispered, her voice weak. Baba Dlamini nodded, his face grim but relieved. It is done. The spirit is gone for good. But as we stood there, looking at the stone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air was still thick with energy, as if the ritual hadn't fully closed the door to the spirit's power. Are you sure it's over? I asked, my voice trembling. Baba Dlamini looked at the stone one last time. Yes, he said, though his voice was uncertain. The stone is sealed. The spirit will not return. But even as he spoke, a cold wind swept through the forest, rustling the trees. And I couldn't help but wonder, had we truly banished it, or had we just delayed the inevitable?